Welcome everybody to Town and Gown. This is now moving into about the the fifth or sixth month of this program now. So we appreciate y'all coming back every single week and continuing to support the program. It means a lot to us. And so, it's good for us newcomers and returners alike to kind of go over the rules, rules of the program a little bit, so everyone can just have that fresh in their mind. So the way these sessions typically work is the speaker, who today is Dr. Wolfe, who's the professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at Michigan State. They spent the first half, about 30 minutes or whatever, giving a brief presentation to the group, on the research areas of expertise and interest to them. And then after the presentation, we typically go into a question and answer session. And so that's moderated by me. So I'm the moderator today. So I'm Tyler. And so during the question and answer session, you guys can either, if you'd like to ask a question, you can just indicate in the chat box, I have a question. And then if it's your turn, I can go ahead and call on you to ask. You can ask the question, Dr. Wolfe, yourself. Or if you just want to type your question out in the chat box, and then I can ask the question, Dr. Wolfe. Either way works for us. We don't have a preference. We're flexible here, whatever works better for you. So then that typically runs about, 35, 45 minutes, however the conversation goes. We typically wrap up around 6:15, 6:20. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Wolfe and we can get started. So.
All right. Thanks, Tyler. I'm going to share my screen and see if I can do it correctly. I've had a little bit of practice over the past year, I guess. There we go. You can see my slide okay, Tyler, everybody? Head check. Okay, awesome. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all virtually. My name is Scott Wolfe. I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice here at Michigan State University. So thanks for taking a bit of your time with me tonight. And thank you to Tyler and John for inviting me to be part of the Town and Gown project. Looking forward to speaking with you all and especially hearing your questions at the end. So as a professor here at Michigan State, I spend most of my time researching and teaching about policing. And so specifically, I use science, right? I collect and analyze data to better understand police officers and the outcomes that they provide to the public. So my own research and teaching focus on a broad spectrum of issues related to policing, ranging from community relations to police training to effective crime control strategies. And so tonight, I wanted to speak with you about several issues that have been discussed frequently over the past few years that have to do with public policy and policing, okay? To do so, I'm going to draw on some of my own research and the research findings from others in the field of criminology to show you what the science says about issues surrounding policing and public policy. And so I guess I'll be bold enough to say that I'm extremely confident that science, using the scientific method, is superior to solving complex social problems like those that we're facing in policing today than simply solely relying on emotion and anecdote, okay? So with that, and to start, in May of last year, just over almost a year ago, George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer. Many of us are familiar with this incident. In fact, the trial has been going on and we are awaiting a jury verdict now. Unless I see that there's a chat that was not from you, John, was it? Is that a verdict?
Guilty on all three charges.
Guilty on all three. Okay. Well, that's significant. We could talk about that later. I appreciate that, John. So we've received a verdict. It changed a little bit of my prepared discussion, but so we have a verdict in the Derek Chauvin case. And what's significant about the George Floyd killing and now the trial of former officer Derek Chauvin, it's important for a number of reasons, but for our purposes tonight, it's led to a new wave of increased public pressure to engage in police reform. And these discussions revolve primarily around three things. The first is police use of force, of course. The second is reimagining the police role in our society by changing their responsibilities all the way to outright abolishment of the institution. And I'll kind of group this together in what I refer to as the defund the police movement. And then third, we focus a lot of our discussion in public discourse and academic discourse on police training and policy reform efforts. And so those are the three things that I want to speak with you a bit about tonight, right? And specifically, I'll focus on what does the science tell us about these issues. Without evidence, we cannot make sound policy decisions. And so we must be guided by what the evidence base says when it is there and when it's available, okay? So the first thing that I want to start with is begin with a discussion that focuses on police use of force. All right, so the defining characteristic of policing, the one that sets it apart from all other occupations except probably the military, is that police officers have the ability to use force against their fellow citizens, right? When we're looking at at police use of force and whether it's reasonable and legal, there's three primary factors that come into play when we determine the level of reasonableness. We refer to these as the Graham factors because of the Supreme Court case Graham v. Connor that established these three factors. Right, so the first one is we take into consideration the severity of the crime, right? All else equal, right? We would be led to believe that a use of force incident is more reasonable the more severe the crime was, right? All else equal. What's important here to remember and is related to the Chauvin trial is this is not in the context of the initial call for service that the police officer was dispatched to investigate. Right. So George Floyd had the police called on him because he apparently was trying to pass a fake $20 bill. Right. Low level seriousness. Now, in the trial, that came into play if any of you watched it. But that's not the only factor that comes into play when we're assessing reasonableness. Any crime that transpires throughout the entire interaction is what we're talking about here with the Supreme Court decision. The second one is whether the suspect posed a threat to the officer or other individuals. And then third, we have to assess whether the suspect was attempting to resist or attempting to flee the officer in that exact situation. So most controversy that we hear talked about in the media and we talk about amongst ourselves revolves around the excessive use of police force, which is defined by the International Association of Chiefs of Police here as the application of an amount and or frequency of force greater than that required to compel compliance from a willing or unwilling subject, right? So this is kind of the ground rules when we're thinking about some of the ground rules, when we're thinking about whether an officer used excessive force or their level of force was reasonable. So when we think about use of force, obviously most controversy surrounding it in the past couple of years, but even really the history of policing, this is true, is focused on police use of deadly force, shooting someone, right? Particularly the use of deadly force against unarmed subjects, and even more particularly against unarmed African Americans in the United States, right? So the media depiction and the general feeling amongst a sizable portion of the public right now is that there is an extremely high risk of being killed by the police if you're an African American and unarmed, right? We hear about these news stories almost every day, right? That's a tragic reality in the United States. Right here in the middle of my presentation, we're talking about the verdict of finally a verdict of one of the rare situations where a police officer is actually charged with a crime, right? And so, Tyler, here's where you can help me out. What I wanted to do is ask you all a question. So if this works, Tyler's going to provide a poll to you. And so the question is multiple choice, right? How many unarmed people, regardless of race, how many unarmed people are killed by the police every year in the United States on average? Right? So just guess, your best guess. I'll give you a couple minutes. We got 29 people. They're trickling in.
Yeah, right now we have about 30% of people responded. So I'll let you know when we get to near everybody.
Okay. And are you going to end polling or do you want me to?
I can do it.
Okay. How many people on average? We got a bunch of people so far. That's good. And then Tyler, when you end that, will that pop up with the results for me to see too?
Yeah, it should be. All right. Go ahead and give it about 10 more seconds and I'll close it.
That looks good. Do you usually have quizzes with these? Didn't know you were being tested, right? All right.
See that?
Yeah, so everybody, hopefully everybody can see that. Thank you, Tyler, for doing that. So what we see, this is very interesting. So not many people thought it was 10, right? I think a vast majority thought it was between 100 and 1,000. If it wasn't multiple choice, I would guess that probably most of you would have typed in a number that was between 1 and 1,000. So almost a third of you think it's, or I'm sorry, 100 and 1,000. So about a third of you think that there's 1,000 unarmed people. Meaningful percentages, I know we're dealing with small numbers, but think it's 10,000. 745 is another answer. So the bulk is here between 100 and 1,000. What's interesting about that is that's pretty much in line with what a recent poll of U.S. residents kind of indicated. The majority of people in a poll, right, or the highest numbers indicated that there's about 1,000 unarmed people killed by the police every year, right? And so what is the real number? We have a pretty good estimate of what that number is. Over the past 5 years, in total, over 5 years, there's been 296 unarmed people killed by the police. And so what that means is we have an average of 59 unarmed people killed by the police every year in the United States. Nowhere near what a lot of people think, right? Now, the reality of the situation is a lot of us would have no idea to begin with. If I did the poll of criminologists, police researchers, they'd probably come up with as much variation. But the magnitude of the problem here is extremely important to get a grasp on, right? Especially if we're going to identify solutions to that problem. So an average of 59 people are killed by the police every year, and they happen to be unarmed. And unarmed, what we're talking about here is they don't have a gun or a knife or some other dangerous weapon. It doesn't necessarily mean in all 59 of those incidents that they weren't somehow attacking the police or otherwise, an unjustified use of force by officers. Now let's think about it, obviously from the really important angle here is among African Americans, the race angle to this. Among these 296 people that are killed and are unarmed over the past 5 years, 94 were African American. So that's about 1/3 of all unarmed killings are of a citizen that's African American. Again, we're dealing with small numbers here in relative terms, that's low frequency, but 32% is about almost 3 times the representation of African Americans in the U.S. population, right? So what we have here is that police killings of unarmed African Americans are very, very rare, but still they are disproportionately impacted compared to whites, right? So we can have those two realities. It is an extremely rare phenomenon, way more rare than we might believe, especially because a lot of our information is filtered through media, right? And they're going to talk about things that are very compelling at the time, right? And so we're a little bit biased in our view for obvious reasons. But at the same time, we can simultaneously acknowledge the fact that that is a problem. Those 59 people on average that were unarmed, or at least a big bulk of them, should not have been killed, right? And we cannot ignore that, okay? So to go a little bit further with the data on police use of force, it's really hard to estimate the extent to which the public has contact with the police, but the government does a fairly decent job with an annual survey. They estimate that about 60 million people have at least one interaction with a police officer annually. That's not 60 million interactions. That's 60 million people that have had contact at least once. So the interactions are much larger because many people have multiple interactions. When we look at the use of force among with the public, about 991 people on average. So right around 1,000 people are killed by the police each year. And so this means, let's see if I can get these zeros correct. This means that 0.0001652% of people that interact with the police are killed, right? A vast majority of these 1,000 people had a weapon and were actively assaulting or attacking a police officer or another person, right? This also means if we go back to the other number, right, the 59 unarmed, that means that 0.0000098% of people that interact with the police are unarmed but are still killed, right? So if you compare that 59 to 999, about 6% of all people that are killed by the police each year were unarmed, right? And this further suggests that there's about a 1 in a million chance of being shot while unarmed while dealing with the police, And actually that number is probably a lot lower because of the issue I mentioned to begin with. Many people have multiple contacts. So there's more than 60 million contacts on the whole. The point here is to show that the risk of being killed by the police is very low, and the risk of being killed while being unarmed is very rare, right? But any of those incidents that are unjustified should not happen. That's why we talk about them all of the time, right? That's why they're in the public's attention right now. That's why we're all updating our phones and the internet to find out what the verdict in the Chauvin trial was, right? So there is a lot that needs to be fixed in policing at the same time as we have to understand what the magnitude of the problems are, right? Use of force problems rank up there at the top of the list of things that need to change and be fixed in American policing today, right? When we talk about race, about 24% of all of those police shootings on an annual basis are of a Black citizen, right? Yet they represent only about 12% of the US population. This needs fixed, right? Such disparities are pervasive in policing, whether we're talking about stopping, searching, arresting, or using other types of use of force against minorities. This needs fixed, right? We need to find ways to limit the need for the police to have contact with the public so often, right? Especially as it pertains to our minority residents in disadvantaged communities, right? But with all of those things said, right, we cannot solve these problems if we aren't real with ourselves about the magnitude of them, right? We have to understand how often it happens, what's most likely, who's most likely to be harmed for us to have a handle on that, right? If we don't have a handle on the magnitude of the problem, we'll misidentify it, we'll misidentify the source of it, and we will develop solutions that are largely ineffective or even dangerous, right? And so that brings us to our next issue, segue into probably the most popular solution that's been talked about over the past year to these problems we face in American policing, and that's defunding the police. This broadly involves significantly reducing police budgets all the way up to abolishing police departments completely. So in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, right, there were calls to defund or even abolish the police. Those calls continue in some jurisdictions throughout the country today, right? If you look at MSU, right, there is even a small movement at MSU on our own campus to abolish our police department, completely get away from having any police presence on campus. Now, I'll say luckily, President Stanley has dismissed such calls for the most part. And I say luckily for this reason. Our campus police have about 10,000 calls for service annually. Do you think we don't need some type of police presence on campus, right? With football on Saturdays, basketball throughout the season, other endless number of events on campus, do you think we don't need police presence? You know, for a lot of you, would you send your son, your daughter, your grandchild to an institution our size without police protection, right? Could probably do a poll. I think I'd know what the answer is for the most part, right? And so we need police in this in the country for a lot of reasons, but we probably need to look at operating in a different way, right? That's the solution. Doing away, carte blanche, with police presence, especially in most jurisdictions, is not the solution. Yet we continue to see defunding calls regarding the police across the country. The problem with those types of calls is that such a move will have an immediate increase in crime if done without solid plans in place and solid alternatives. This is simple and clearly demonstrated. So we'll talk about that here. Here, I'll give you a case study, basically, of what happened in the aftermath of Floyd's death, subsequent civil unrest, and calls to defund the police in Denver, Colorado. So this figure represents data from Denver that I worked on with some colleagues, and we published the results of this a couple months back in an op-ed in the Denver Post. So these lines represent percentage change from the previous year's averages. So we're looking at all years in the past compared to what happened in 2020. Okay, so 0, that horizontal line that goes right through the middle, I think it's orange, but the flat line, that represents 0 change. Anything that's above that line indicates there is an increase. Anything below, there is a decrease. So we can see, look at the first vertical line on the left-hand side, and that's the time in the date of the state of emergency issued in Colorado because of COVID. right? As you would expect, police stops, you can see that blue line that dips down below that 0, declined immediately after their stay-at-home order. Property crime in purple, violent crime in red, they're at the top, stayed about stable or had slight increases for a few weeks after the stay-at-home order. Then the second interruption we see there is when George Floyd's protest, the killing of George Floyd and subsequent protests happened in Colorado, in Denver in particular. And what we see is police stop behavior while it was returning to normal before the protest, it plummeted again. And you can see it has sustained low activity since then, okay? And what also happened at the same time as that is crime really took off, particularly violent crime. The main reason that this occurred is because the police pulled back from proactive policing, largely in response to public criticism, right? So they were kind of doing what the public was saying, we don't want the police, and so they pulled back. This resulted in fewer stops, right? This is what depolicing would really look like. The consequence was fewer felony arrests, fewer guns off the street, right? And greater emboldenment among the would-be offender population. And so if we look at what happened in Colorado, and we see this in other cities across the United States because of the unfortunate good case study that 2020 provided us, is this is what it would look like if we significantly defunded the police department overnight, right? Their pullback is essentially less police on the street. And the result in Denver was a 50% increase in homicide, right? And so I don't have the same kind of fancy graph for Detroit, but our own hometown saw a very different trend. From 2019 to 2020, Detroit experienced a 20% or about 19% increase in homicides. Now, in an interesting way, that's not that bad. It's significant, but that's in comparison to other large cities across the United States that experienced about an average of a 30% increase, right? So they had a much smaller increase than most large cities like Denver. And here's what's the really interesting thing. When you look at the Detroit police data, they did not have a similar pullback in proactive policing efforts. So their stops did not decline as much as we see in other cities that experienced large increases in violent crime. Okay. So the roots of this problem have a long history in policing, but they trace back most recently to 2014 when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. So in the aftermath of that incident, we saw a tremendous amount of protests like we're seeing today, but probably even more, aimed at police use of force and reform. The moniker "Hands Up, Don't Shoot" was born in Ferguson, right? It became a rallying cry and title of a new book by one of my colleagues for protests and reform. So one thing I'll say as an aside related to Hands Up, Don't Shoot is the subsequent Department of Justice investigation in Ferguson revealed that there was actually no evidence that Mr. Brown had his hands up when he was shot by former police officer Darren Wilson. Forensic evidence runs counter to this claim. And moreover, or more importantly, the witness that originally claimed this to be the case later recanted his statement, right? So Mr. Brown, at least from an evidence standpoint, did not have his hands up when he was shot. But the implications of that incident are long lasting. Nationwide, even internationally, protests led to police officers pulling back from their duties and engaging or not engaging in policing, depolicing, right? Colleague and I started to do research on what's referred to as the Ferguson effect shortly after Mr. Brown's death, right? We want to know how this was impacting cops, right? Because we know that effective, good policing can be important for communities, especially marginalized communities. We found that negative media attention from the police officer standpoint, protests directed at policing, led officers to be less willing to work with the community to solve problems. That is, they were less likely to engage in community policing. It reduced their motivation to work on the job. It reduced their overall morale and job satisfaction. We also found that in Missouri, right, the epicenter of the Ferguson effect, police agencies engaged in 67,000 fewer traffic stops between 2014 and 2015. A lot of that's probably good, right, because they're originally engaging in too many traffic stops, but it's a significant change. But it actually puts things in perspective when you compare it to the Floyd effect that we're seeing in places like Denver. One agency, the Denver Police, engaged in 31,000 fewer traffic stops between 2019 and 2020, whereas all police agencies in the state of Missouri conducted 67,000 fewer stops, right? So this is really where the Ferguson effect and the Floyd effects drastically differ. The George Floyd effect, the killing of George Floyd, created a much larger, much longer lasting change on police behavior and subsequent outcomes that will continue to the foreseeable future. So together, this means that public criticism impacts the police. Sometimes this is a really good thing, right? That's the point of a lot of protesting, to initiate change. So sometimes it changes policing for the better, right? We're seeing that in the aftermath of George Floyd in some areas. But it also impacts them negatively and produces negative outcomes. A lack of motivation among police officers means less police work and worse police work. And in some cities, that leads to more crime. So what can we do about reforming the police today? So broadly speaking, the first thing we should do is think deeply about police budgets and spending. Not be lazy and go to the lazy solution of simply taking money away and defunding police departments indiscriminately with no plan, right? That's not evidence-based and it's not wise. We know what will likely happen if we do that. What we need to do is ensure that police agencies are using their resources in a wise way, right? We need to ensure that the budgets are being dedicated towards effective crime control strategies, right? So the police need to spend most of their time focusing efforts on specific places that we know are problematic and on specific people that contribute to the crime problem, right? Rather than casting wide nets. Second, we need to look for alternatives that have been proven or hopeful at being cheaper, safer, and effective to policing. So this will be difficult, unfortunately, right now, because there's not a lot of evaluations that have been dedicated towards looking at the effectiveness of many alternatives to policing that a lot of folks are advocating for. But there are alternatives to traditional policing that might prove effective as we move forward. The first one, I would say, is mental health crisis professionals being used to co-respond with officers to particular calls, right? We call these co-responder programs. There's been some evidence that's emerging over the past couple years suggesting these types of programs might be useful. But here's the key here, those aren't free, right? And so when we talk about defunding the police, that might be a misguided discussion. While we need to focus on what the police are doing with the resources, if we want to be effective at preventing harm, especially unnecessary harm to the public, but also preventing them from being victimized, right? This type of solution might actually warrant more money, which is what a lot of folks don't want to hear, but that just might be the reality of the situation. Second, we need to take responsibility away from the police so they can focus on things we know impact crime. They're doing too much right now, and they're taking time away from effective crime control strategies that save people from being a victim of violent crime. So in particular, one really good way that we could do this almost immediately is maybe scale back the amount of time that police spend engaging in non-moving violation traffic stop activity and enforcement, right? Not do away with traffic stops in all our traffic enforcement, right? Because that has the added benefit of saving people's lives on the roadways. But non-moving violations are probably not providing a great return on investment. And we need to focus on changes to police reforms, changes to police reform with respect to their policies. So the first policy that I would tackle, right, and that we've done, my colleagues have effectively done in agencies across the country, is getting them to track how often their officers point a gun at a person. You would be absolutely shocked to know that many, if not most, police agencies around the country don't require their officers to fill out a report or even log when they point a gun at another human being, right? Therefore, we have no clue how often it happens and if certain officers do it more or less likely than their colleagues, right? So we need to track this for a number of reasons. First, it could be useful in identifying potentially problematic behavior from officers. Second, and probably most importantly, it sets the cultural tone in our agencies that pointing a gun at a human is a serious endeavor and warrants tracking, right? That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing and that officers should never do it. Unfortunately, police officers are going to have to use their gun from time to time, especially in a country that has millions, hundreds of millions of guns, right? It doesn't mean it's bad, but rather that when an officer points a gun at another person, it should only be done in a life-threatening situation. And we're going to keep track of it, all right? Research actually shows that if you make that simple policy change, you can dramatically reduce the overall level of use of force in an agency, right? Another reform effort in terms of policy is duty to intervene. These are policies that require officers to step in or intervene when they see a colleague using too much force or acting inappropriately. These can be really effective at controlling wayward behavior, especially when we're talking about senior officers that might be doing it, right? Several high-profile programs across the country have successfully implemented duty to intervene policies and training programs, right? We have to wonder, unfortunately, if George Floyd would still be alive if the Minneapolis Police Department had a duty to intervene policy, right? Derek Chauvin is a 19-year veteran of the police force. Those officers that were on scene with him, some of them had been police officers for less than 5 days. He was a senior police officer. He was their field training officer. Do you think in the environment like policing, think about your own job, even if you're not a cop or have never been in the military, would you be willing to, your 5th day on the job, say, hey, 19-year-old vet, you're doing it wrong? Would they have intervened, right? No, it's a cultural and a policy problem, right? There was one officer that attempted to intervene, but stopped because he probably realized this is a veteran I'm talking to and I better shut up, right? Last thing I want to mention here, and probably the biggest issue I think that needs reform in policing today in the United States has to do with training reform. Our officers are severely undertrained. In some states, officers receive as little as 400 hours of training before they hit the street, right? And some, that's probably being a little gratuitous, right? They go out earlier. More importantly, there is insufficient recertification or continual education training that officers receive. And related to this is the need for repetition when it comes to that type of training. Most police training, especially recertification training that officers have to go to on an annual basis, is one-off or one day or even only a few hours, right? That's not sufficient. And so there are many types of potential police training that we could pursue. Again, unfortunate thing, but this is changing, is that we don't have a lot of research to go on here, right? So the first area of training that we hear a lot about, even in our own state of Michigan, is implicit bias training. We all have implicit biases that shape our thoughts, our attitudes, and our behavior. And so the thought is to train police officers to recognize those biases to improve the behavior that may follow from that bias. The problem is that there's tons of research, and in fact, a really high-profile meta-analysis that shows implicit biases are very difficult and if not impossible in some situations to change, right? To date, we only have one study that has evaluated implicit bias training among police officers, and it found that it doesn't reduce use of force. And this was not a study conducted in an agency with 30 officers. It was conducted in the New York City Police Department, right? So limited evidence that that might be the solution, at least to our immediate problems. Maybe long-term, there's more to be said there. Second is de-escalation training, which involves teaching officers skills to calm down situations, right? One recent study showed that this training combined with relevant policy changes can significantly reduce the use of force among police officers. So this is really promising. Third, and kind of relatedly, is procedural justice training. This focuses on teaching officers interaction skills, communication skills, is aimed at establishing rapport and trust among people they're interacting with, treating people with respect. There's been several studies now over the past couple of years that have shown such training may improve officers' interaction skills and reduce their reliance on the use of force. So again, more encouraging evidence. This is where we need to be going in terms of real reform efforts. And then finally, we have what I'll refer to as social interaction-based training. The problem with all of the other programs I just mentioned and ones that aren't listed here is they are typically very siloed, right? They focus on one type of skill and they lack repetition. They're usually 1 or 2 day training programs at best. Social interaction-based training, in contrast, when done properly, focuses on a wide range of communication skills that officers practice and develop over time. It combines things like de-escalation, procedural justice, and others, right? And most importantly, it's offered repeatedly to officers over long periods of time, maybe several months. That allows officers for repeated practice and expertise development and acquisition. look, right? Some of the football fans out here might get this analogy, right? We don't put a quarterback, right? We wouldn't put the MSU quarterback in for one play during practice to throw one practice pass and then go out and expect him to throw for 400 yards and 3 touchdowns on Saturday, right? Right? Why would we expect our officers to develop important skills without sustained repetitive practice and training in the same way, right? That's all I have right now. I'm really excited to hear what questions you all might have. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Wolfe. That was an excellent presentation. I
Thanks, sir.
forgot to mention before that I've had Dr. Wolfe now for 2 separate classes, and he's one of my favorite professors. So I enjoyed hearing him lecture again. So
I appreciate that, Tyler. Means a lot.
Yeah. So so it looks like we already have some questions in the chat box. So we can just go ahead and transition right into that. So the first one is from Nelk. I guess that's how you say his name. He asked, is the information that you're using about he was armed, like the rates of people that are armed when they're interacting with the police, that's coming from police reports? Is it coming from something else? I guess he was concerned about the potential of weapons getting planted.
Yeah, awesome question. One of the darndest things that we face as a country, but obviously me as a policing researcher, up until the past couple years, we had no idea how many times people are killed by the police. Let that sink in, right? We had no idea. We had no estimate. There's no national tracking mechanism. There's no requirement for police officers, police departments to report on it, right? The data that I was speaking about at the beginning of the presentation is from the Washington Post, right? So we've had to rely on news agencies in particular, and there's a couple activist organizations that are doing a really good job of kind of doing it for us, right? And so the Washington Post data is some of the best that's available out there. And they rely on their own news reports and police reports. And so they do a deep dive into trying to uncover every single fatal encounter that the public has with the police. And these are not only shootings, these are like they were involved in a traffic crash too. A lot of people are killed because of traffic crashes, a pursuit. And so there is a possibility, I think, to go directly to your question, that if you were relying solely on the police, that there'd be a question of planting. I think that's exceedingly rare. I won't say that it hasn't happened. I'll give you a good example, and Tyler might remember this from our policing class. Not a planting a gun, because that's really, really serious, but planting drugs or more fabricating data actually comes up. So I worked on the consent decree in the New Orleans Police Department. And one of the reasons they were under consent decree is they were kind of cooking the books to make it look like the French Quarter was safer than it is, right? And so do the police lie? Yeah, right? Are they planting guns on people? Probably has happened, but probably not often. Right.
Good question. So let's see. The next question comes from Bob. Bob was wondering, do the police need to be armed while on routine patrol? And what fraction of police interaction with civilians does the policeman draw a gun? Which I guess you covered a little bit in your presentation.
Yeah, the second part of that question, how often they draw a gun, we have no clue, right? We're just now finding out how many people they kill, right? Like, I'm not laughing because it's an extremely serious matter, but it's just crazy to me that we don't know that number, or we don't have a historical view on that. Is it necessary for the police to carry a gun? Yes. And I think the main reason I say yes is because of how many guns we have in the United States, right? I'm not going to turn this into a gun control topic, right? But the reality situation, regardless of who I am, right? I'm a hunter, I'm an outdoorsman, right? I own firearms, right? And I'm not saying I'm a huge gun rights advocate, right? But you can't escape the reality that there's too many guns in the United States too, especially illegal guns that are in the hands of people that are willing to do harm. And so if we don't tackle multiple problems that we're facing simultaneously, we can't get to the point where our officers aren't going to need a gun. Would I like the day where our cops didn't need them? Sure, that'd be great, but we're not there yet.
Another really good question. I got a private message from Kathy here. She asked, how does the pandemic figure like affect these statistics you were pointing at, specifically with the Denver Police Department?
Yeah, great question. That was actually the kind of one of the main focuses of our research and the op-ed that we did briefly about it. As you can see from those, if I went back to those lines, we wanted to know the extent to which COVID and the stay-at-home orders impacted police behavior and crime, and then what changed over and above that the George Floyd protests happened. And what we see is things were really returning to normal within about a 2-month period after COVID hit in Denver. We see a similar thing in other cities across the United States. And then George Floyd's murdered. We can literally say that now, even though I said that before, but now we have a verdict. He was murdered by Derek Chauvin, right? Immediately after that and the subsequent protests is when the biggest impact on policing activity happened. And that sustained throughout the year, right? It wasn't like a 1-week blip in less traffic stops and pedestrian stops. It was sustained throughout an entire year. And that had a direct, nearly causal effect on violent crime.
Another really good question. All right, so the next question comes from Dottie. Dottie asked how many police officers were killed while on duty in the past year in the U.S.
That's a good question. I should have that statistic. I don't know the exact number, but we average less than 100. I want to say for some reason around 60. But that number might be much lower. I could look that up. So don't quote me on that. Much less than 100. But that's also involving, I should preface that, that's also involving traffic collisions too. Right? So how many are shot? Much fewer. Usually traffic collisions and getting shot oscillate back and forth from year to year.
Another really good question. The next question has come from Bennett. Bennett asks, is there a place for citizen education on how to interact with the police? He's talking about how he's heard that some communities have like a culture of resisting arrest. And so I don't know if you had a comment on that.
Yeah, if I'm interpreting it correctly, training people on how to appropriately deal with the police so you don't get shot, right? There are not really formal from the police. I think citizens police academies over the past couple years have started to actually have those conversations. More you're seeing community groups, I think, bringing people in, like bringing a police officer in, in kind of a similar situation to this, to have that conversation. It's really unfortunate that we even have to ask that question, right? That how should we interact with the police? Now, and one of the things I was talking about early in the presentation is having a firm grip on how often this happens. Your risk of being shot by the police, even if you're African-American and unarmed, is extremely low, right? That's the reality. But I say that as a white dude, right? That didn't have to grow up in a situation where I had to talk with my parents specifically about how to interact with the police. That is the reality that African-Americans in our country face, right? And that shouldn't happen, but it is, right? I think in situations like this, best thing I would tell you to do, right? If this were a training, keep your hands out the window. Right.
Another really good question. All right, the next question comes from John. John asks, should body cams be mandatory?
Yes. That would be my, and then my caveat is if we had the money to do it, right? Should body cams be mandatory? Absolutely, they should if money wasn't the issue. And it always comes to that. Any public policy issue we're talking about, it does, unfortunately. Couple things that I'll mention related to body cams is they are an indispensable tool, right? That was a huge piece of evidence in the Chauvin trial, right? But luckily we had cell phone video because there was a lot of what that cell phone caught that body cam would have been useless in. If they didn't have cell phone footage of Chauvin killing George Floyd, I don't know if we would have been talking about it as significant a conviction right now, right? So it's not the silver bullet, but it can be really beneficial, not only in protecting citizens, But I tell this to cops all the time that are hesitant to it. It protects them too from a lot of frivolous, incorrect criticism that they might face. The body cameras themselves, a lot of people I think are interested in this fact, are expensive, but they're mostly a one-time cost. What's more expensive is the storage of the data. The storage of the data is not free. And so depending on your policy, if you have your officers recording their entire shift, that's an incredible, I'm not a computer, expert or anything, but it's an incredible amount of data that has to be stored and they have to pay for that service, right? So buy stock in cloud-based companies, AWS.
Another really good question. These have all been good questions so far. Next question comes from Joe and Kathy. They asked me, police officers are killed annually. That you already answered that one, but they also followed up with, are there police departments in the U.S. that are performing in a better manner compared to others?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Sure, there are, but it depends on what we're talking about. Depends on, if some are really good at having like state of the art or best practices in terms of their policy. Some are better at their training. Some are better at their interactions with the public, and some are good at, kind of all of them. I would say that some of the agencies that I've interacted with and that I work with, that's what I do, is I partner with police agencies on this type of research, right? The Tucson Police Department in particular is one, and we have 18,000 police agencies in the United States. So don't think that they're like the best one. It's just based on my experience. Some that I can give examples of are an awesome agency when it comes to training, right? They have more of what we would call a culture of training, or a training culture in that agency, which is really important. If any of you have military experience, you can appreciate that almost all of your existence in military is training, right? The police don't have that luxury to train all of the time because they have calls for service to respond to, right? But we have to strike a balance in that we need more training more often, more of the time in police agencies. And to do that, you need to change the culture. And you see, unfortunately for us here in Michigan, I'm not saying our agencies aren't good at it, but Western agencies tend to have better handle on training culture, or agencies that are in close proximity to military bases like Fayetteville, North Carolina, right next to Fort Bragg is a great one because most of their officers have military experience. So training is just ingrained in them, right?
Another excellent question. Another private message from Kathy here. She asked, has there been any discussion about changing the incentivizing of the incentive structure regarding police for traffic stops?
Yes, not so much an incentive on their part, but to just take it away completely, to de-incentivize jurisdictions and municipalities in particular for relying on revenue generation from traffic tickets. All right. Now, a lot of it's the reality, right? Play devil's advocate a little bit. You'd be shocked sometimes how much of your budget comes from traffic enforcement in some jurisdictions, right? It's a lot. You got to make up that money somehow, but that's probably a change that most folks are willing to make if it solves some of the tragic incidents that we have. They're unnecessary, right? We saw, with Dante Wright outside of Minneapolis a couple weeks ago, right? Did he commit a crime? Yeah. Right? Did he do something he probably shouldn't have done? He lunged into a car. Should he be executed because of it? No. Right? And so if we weren't in the business of non-moving violation traffic enforcement, that would have never happened.
Another really good question. These have all been really good questions so far. Patricia has a question. She asked, who monitors video from the police body cams?
Yeah. Sometimes no one. That's another question. That's a great question to actually circle back to the previous one about body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras are only effective if you use them. And there has to be good policy and willing supervisors to do either random, some type of regimented checking of body cam footage, right? You've seen agencies more and more over the years get better at that and realize that they have to do it not only for own purposes in finding officers that might be misbehaving and it's just going under the radar because nobody's complaining about it, and filtering those people out. We had an example here with the Michigan State Police. You may have seen, this was a couple months back now, right? Where I think it was one of their canine officers or troopers let their dog bite an individual for a long time, right? I don't know where that case is now, but they found that not because the person complained, as weird as that sounds, right? They didn't complain. It was a result of a random review from the supervisor, right? So if you don't do that, if you're not monitoring it, the body cams are useless. Monumental task though, too.
Another excellent question. The next question is definitely a doozy. It's from Dr. Waller. He asked, can police reform ever really work without being coupled with major structural changes to undo the legacies and ongoing practices of racial discrimination and de facto residential segregation?
That's a great question. Truly from a PhD right there. I like that. Yes. I hope. I'm confident. I'm optimistic about that because if we can't, the only other solution is to burn it to the ground. Which a lot of people, I think, maybe some folks on here are like, "Yep, do it, burn it to the ground," and that's fair, right? We live in a great country; we can have that view. But I fear, especially in the short/long term, what happens to our communities. And remember, when I say it impacts crime, like depolicing, defunding, it's not I'll be blunt, it's not impacting my community, right? It's impacting African Americans and Latino communities across the country that are disproportionately impacted by violent crime to begin with, right? So those are the communities that we should be paying attention to. So to go back to your question, I think it can be changed, right? One issue is we have a history in policing of roots in racism and slave patrols, right? That is not the ultimate origin of policing, especially in the United States, right? We had policing in the United States before the slave patrols, but in the South in particular, if I was at the University of South Carolina before this, if we were talking about policing and its history and slave patrols, that's the reality down there, right? That's where it did originate, but that varies by across the country. So instead of rambling, I hope so, John.
Excellent question. Next question comes from Jennifer. Jennifer asked, are police trained to shoot to kill or trained to injure? And is there data on police shooting related injuries? Just not
yeah, that's an awesome question for a number of reasons. First, it's a very common question I get. Tyler, you probably remember talking about this in our policing class. Police are taught, they should be, to shoot to kill, right? The reason why I say should be is because it goes back to just pointing a gun. You do not use a gun. You don't point a gun at another human unless that's a really bad situation, it's life or death. And so there's no other reason to shoot somebody except to kill them. There's no reason to point a gun at somebody except that you might have to kill them, right? And that is where we talked about why that should happen. I would love for that not to be the case. I guarantee you 90.999% of police officers would just say, I'd love to not have to worry about that, right? Maybe the Derek Chauvins of the world are the exception, right? The other thing is we don't know how often it happens, right? We don't know. And so there was the second part of the question. I kind of lost my train of thought. Tyler, can you read that again?
Yeah, she was just asking about data on shooting related injuries, just compared to fatalities.
Yeah, injuries. Yeah. So going back to this discussion of, thank you, Tyler, of not knowing how many people are killed. On top of that, right, when we talk about all these numbers and we talk about the risk of getting shot by the police, really those are flawed statistics. I'm gonna like blindside my whole discussion, or that part of the discussion is because it's the wrong denominator. We don't have any idea how many people are shot in the United States by the police. In fact, I would venture to say if you asked police agencies, if you're able to gain access, a vast majority of them wouldn't have a really accurate estimate of how often their own officers have shot a gun in the past year. Some do really good. Don't mischaracterize what I'm saying, right? All right, I'm sure that big agencies, really progressive agencies like MSP, Detroit, they know, right? But with 18,000 departments across the country, they just simply don't know how often it happens. We need that information as badly as we need to track how often people are killed, because that gives you the true number of how many people are at risk to die from the police, right? How many people are shot but don't die, right?
Another excellent question. I remember I thought that exact question to myself when I had Dr. Wolfe's class. I was like, oh, why don't they just shoot him in the leg?
Yeah, and the reason you don't do that, I mean, just to not to belabor the point too much, the reason you don't do that is there's only one reason you should fire the gun, is because there's an imminent threat of death to you or others. And if you fire a gun at somebody's leg, that's really hard to hit, right? Sorry to get really graphic, but you came into a talk about policing, as Tyler knows from my classes. It's hard to hit that object, and there's a greater risk of that bullet going to a place you don't intend. That's why police officers aren't trained. In fact, it would be legally unjustified to do so.
Excellent question, Jennifer. Thank you. Let's see. Another question from Joel and Kathy. They asked, how much training do police officers on average receive before getting put out on the street?
Yeah, so it ranges depending on the size of the agencies you're talking about and the location of the agency. So if you go down south, not to pick on my former home, down south, they don't have as many hours on average that are required, right? So I would say the average is probably 400 to 600 hours, but many agencies require much more, right? Some agencies go up all the way to 900, but I think that the average is probably closer to the 400 mark. So basically, what's that, 3 months? And then, I mean, it's sometimes hard to answer that, but when I say that, I'm talking about academy training, a new boot, a new officer. That's how many hours of training they're getting. And then they're on probation, right? They go with a training officer for another, sometimes up to a year. In some agencies, there's a 2-year probationary period where that senior officer has to make sure that they're good enough to be a cop. Problem is that sometimes you have people like Derek Chauvin that are training officers.
Another really good. Sorry, Dr.
No, go ahead.
This is another really good question. Here's a question from Nelk. He asked, are you familiar with the FBI former agent who published a recent research paper on the white supremacists and hate groups were encouraging their members to apply to police forces?
I'm not familiar with that. That's for real. Wow.
It definitely sounds
scary,
whatever it is.
Yeah, hopefully we have some good screening procedures. I am not familiar.
Next question is from Nancy. She asked, to what extent are the research results you shared available and or being distributed to the public through various print and digital media?
Oh, that's a great question. I would love for it to be more publicly accessible. And so one way you can do that is follow me on Twitter if you're on Twitter. Right, I talk about it on Twitter. I try not to go on there a lot, but more importantly, anything you would want, you can email me about, especially anything that was talked about in this presentation. I can give you that op-ed we talked about, any of the papers I produced, anything like that. That's a different topic of a public institution not having public research available, even though our taxpayers pay for it. But we can thank the publishers for that right now. That's a different social problem we have to fix. So just email me. I think I had it at the end of my presentation, but maybe Tyler, I don't know if it was in the initial invite, my contact information.
Yeah, I can put your email in the chat in a second.
Yeah,
that was also a more general question, not just your research or specifically what you talked about, but in general, how much does the science surrounding this whole issue get out there so that it isn't just total opinion that we're hearing all the time?
Yeah. Oh, so how much does the science actually inform real policy or public discussions? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's getting better, right? But we all live in echo chambers, even our politicians and policymakers, and so sometimes it's better than worse. I know over the past year, I've given testimony to our legislators. I've testified in Colorado about that from a public policy standpoint. We're getting better at distributing our research to the folks that matter, whether it's our state legislators or our police agencies. You know, when I do work, you know, most of my stuff is with police agencies, so I have a direct contact to them. Now the trick is to getting them to act on the evidence. That's a little bit more difficult, but it's there.
Really good question, Nancy. Thank you for that. And thank you for clarifying as well. Next question comes from, here we go. Next one can come from Stan. Stan asked, how should police deal with someone who's unarmed and trying to flee?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, how should the police deal with someone who's unarmed and attempting to flee?
That's good. I think the first thing I would say, you'd like, I'm going to play cop now. So it's a typical cop response, like, I need more information, right? Are they on foot? Are they in a car? And for what crime? I think the biggest thing, and probably one that needs to be the center of a lot of discussions about police reform, is the seriousness of the offense that you're wanting that person for when they flee, right? I think that's probably the biggest factor. Now, how to respond to it, you know, obviously, if that's an active shooter and they don't have a gun, that's a suspected active shooter, but they don't have their gun in their hand right now. Me personally, Scott, as a citizen, right, is going to say, I want them to get that person at all costs, right? Get them off the street, right? But, you know, say George Floyd, let's use his example because it's in the front of my mind and probably yours. You know, say he had actually tried to run from Derek Chauvin, right, for passing a fake $20 bill. Do we need that, right? I'll tell you this: if it was in a car, should we pursue George Floyd? No. Right. I have cops that are friends, right? I work with cops, right? And what's funny about my research is I make cops and citizens mad, you know, regardless of what I say, right? And so when it comes to police pursuits, it's not worth the risk. Way more people die because they were killed by someone crashing into them from a police pursuit than die from getting shot while unarmed. Talking like thousands a year.
Another excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
Joel and Kathy had a question. They asked, are there psychological tests that can be given to screen out, you know, bullies and, you know, just potential problems prior to hiring a police officers?
There are that they use, and I think for the most part, especially over time, they are fairly effective. The problem is you're not going to be able to screen out everybody. The bigger issue is a lot of even the best screening tool, if you came up with it, might not have screened out Derek Chauvin or other problematic officers, right? And so as weird as it seems, but if we're trying to identify and then solve problems, I don't think Derek Chauvin was necessarily a bad cop or a bad guy. Right? He certainly probably didn't wake up that morning hoping to kill an African-American, right? What the problem is his lack of training and his lack of self-control and his lack of ability to release some of that control out of fear of looking like a punk in the eyes of everybody that was standing there with a cell phone in his face, right? He had to demonstrate to everybody in that situation that he was under control and you weren't going to tell me what to do. That was the problem with that. Not because he had some type of personality defect that could have been caught earlier. It's because of the culture within that agency, the culture in policing that allowed Derek Chauvin to have that type of interaction with George Floyd, right? So it's more of a training issue, if you ask me, than a screening issue. But acknowledging that screening is probably something that we should probably revisit.
another really good question. I'm going to skip to Alex's real quick. Alex asked, another former student of yours, Alex asked, how does the adoption of community policing strategies contribute to greater officer accountability?
Oh, that's a good one. Alex Dean? I saw that part.
Yep.
Alex, how are you?
Yes.
Good question. Has it resulted in greater accountability? I don't know. Specifically, the change to more community policing, it probably not directly led to it. I think the move towards more community-oriented policing was on the same wave as other reform efforts, right? So it happened to overlap with the public demanding more transparency for things like we're talking about, for data, how often use of force is used and everything like that. I think when done properly though, right, what true community policing is, right? So Alex and Tyler, you'll remember this from my class on community policing, right? Is, you ask police departments around the country, do you do community policing? Every single one of them, all 18,000, I guarantee you would say yes, right? I'd put a lot of money on that, all right? The problem is like, they don't really know what community policing is, right? So what do you do for community policing? Well, we play basketball and we have ice cream socials, right? And we do coffee with a cop. How many of you have ever been to a coffee with a cop, right? Those are good, and those are probably nice. Those are nice things to do for your community. It's not community-oriented policing. It's not accountability. It's not working with the community to solve problems. True community policing is having regular meetings where everybody from the community has the opportunity to have a voice in what happens in their neighborhood, right? Here are the problems we're facing as citizens. Okay, what do you say about it, police? Now here's what we say should be done. Giving them a voice, giving them some type of license in what happens in their community. If you get to that point, then community policing actually becomes a real accountability mechanism. Great question. You can tell why Alex crushed my classes.
A good question, Al. So Dr. Wall had a question. I'll kind of backtrack to it. Yeah, he asked, how much does it help to have rules where the police are required to live in close proximity to the areas in which they work in?
Yeah, there is no good evidence that I know of. That's a great question though, and it's actually becoming more common. Like I've had this conversation with my in-laws recently. They're from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and my father-in-law thinks, well, just require police officers to live in Green Bay, and that'll provide better outcomes. And so the thought is, if we have officers in our community, they have more of a stake, right? And I think there's probably something to be said about that. The problem becomes in many agencies that have tried to have what we call residency restriction. You have to live within the jurisdiction or within so many miles of the jurisdiction to be employed. Is that unfortunately a lot of police officers wouldn't want to live in the communities they have to police, right? And that's a really sad thing to say. But when we're talking about a situation where we need the best, most self-controlled, well-trained, educated officers that we can afford, that further limits potential applicant pool when you have those situations. So I think on the whole, and with a caveat that we need research on that, like a true academic, I'll say, it probably wouldn't be as effective as we think. I think one thing, just to kind of be a little tangential, the best thing that comes from residency restrictions is officer fatigue, right? So especially out in California is a really good example. California police officers typically don't live anywhere near their jurisdiction, especially in the LA area, because they can't afford to, right? They don't make enough money. They have to live 2, sometimes 3 hours away. I'm not making that up. I've worked with officers out there, right? So they'll commute 3 hours and they'll spend the night and then they'll work like 3 shifts. Problem is that they're commuting back and forth doing that. And then you expect them to go out on the street and be self-controlled and make good decisions that have people's lives at stake. That's the biggest issue with residency restrictions.
Good question, Dr. Weller. We're just about getting towards the end, so I'm going to go ahead and ask Patricia's question, and that'll probably be just about the last one. So Patricia asked, what are requirements for becoming a police officer?
Varies across the country widely. We were actually, John and Tyler and I were talking a little bit about this to begin, before everyone hopped on. the biggest change that we've seen in requirements over, I would say, the past 2 decades is a move towards requiring an undergraduate degree, right? There's a lot of things we can talk about what the value of an undergraduate degree is, and I'm not trying to, because my employer is a university, say that, but it's perspective taking, I think, is the biggest thing, right? You're coming from a particular background, and when you go to a university, you're forced into a situation with people that come from very different backgrounds, and you're forced to think about and talk about and write about and be tested on different perspectives of people and backgrounds, right? I think when I think of our students that go through the School of Criminal Justice, certainly if they're taking my policing class, I hope they gain this, is some type of appreciation for what the other person that you might be interacting with goes through, right? That's the skills I think that are most valuable, especially from a liberal arts education. That is not a requirement in all agencies across the United States, right? Typically, the standard is a high school diploma, right? You have to have a high school degree. And in the past, it was like no drug use, no felony record, right? Certainly no domestic violence in the background. But I'll tell you what's happening, not to leave us on a somber note, kind of going back to how public criticism does impact policing. We are seeing a significant reduction in the number of people that are willing to be police officers. We are in a crisis right now, and I'm not trying to be hyperbolic, in our own state of people that are interested in being police officers. And I say it's a crisis, not because I think we need more cops necessarily. We need better cops, right? So if we're at the point where the people that are the most educated, the most controlled, the most open-minded are not interested in being police officers, that's the exact opposite end of the spectrum of where we need to be heading, right? And so when it comes, I love that question, because when we talk about standards, I think we need to keep that in mind when we're trying to cultivate a police force that has our best interests in mind as citizens and provides us the best outcomes, right? Because they're us, right? And they serve us. And so that's what we should be striving to obtain.
Excellent question, Patricia, and a really good one to end on. This definitely was one of the most lively town and gown discussions, so I really appreciated everyone's participation. And of course, I appreciated the presentation by Dr. Wolfe and then answering all our questions. Everyone, just give one last final round of applause to Dr. Wolfe virtually.
I appreciate it, everyone. It was a joy, pleasure. If you have any questions that you weren't able to ask, Tyler put my contact information in the chat, so reach out. The ladies are my neighbors across the street, so that's them. If you could see them they're literally across the street. So good to see you all.
So Scott, I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone here. That was just so outstandingly helpful and clear.
I appreciate it. That's great to hear.
So much.
Thank you very much.
Just a wonderful display of expertise. The bad news is that we don't have Town and Gown next week because Dr. Nazita Lejavadi is on a very nice sabbatical in Sweden and in Oxford, and it doesn't work for her next Tuesday. She will instead give a Town and Gown around about midday in June. So we'll be skipping next Tuesday, and then the Tuesday following we'll be joined by Deborah Moriarty from the College of Music, who will talk about her life in music. So, yeah, Scott, thanks again, and Tyler, thank you. And everybody stay well and see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone.